Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. He opens a casement in the house, a window within the palace. Baal opens rifts in the clouds. Baal gives forth his holy voice. Baal discharges the utterances of his lips. His holy voice convulses the earth. The mountains quake. Ancient Near Eastern texts relating to the Old Testament, edited by James B. Pritchard, 3rd edition, Princeton University Press. Today we're going to press on with another topic that is literally central to the understanding of the First Temple of Jerusalem period, also known as Solomon's Temple. What could this topic be? What is the absolutely most central point, literally and metaphorically, in any temple? The Holy of the Holies, so to speak. That topic is what God or gods were worshipped, honored, and celebrated in a temple or the temple. Our objective in this episode will be to sort out who was the god worshipped at Solomon's temple, and where did the idea, the ideology, you might say the theology of that god, where did it come from? This episode certainly won't and can't truly reach that objective, but we can at least get a good overview of the topic of the God of Solomon's temple and his context. We'll also get a chance to make some more speculations and ask some more questions. This episode is in a continuing series that is and was inspired by Rome-level patron Peter the Great and others on the First Temple of Jerusalem. We have mostly focused on the Second Temple of Jerusalem in this entire podcast because that's the period that most directly and immediately shaped Christianity of the first century CE. But you can't have a second temple without a first, so it's worth spending a bit of time on in this era because it's fun, at least I think so, and we'll definitely get to build a little bit more of that context we need to understand the Second Temple. So now here's the easy part. We can say with great certainty who the God was who was worshipped at the Temple of Solomon. That is Yahweh. And I'm just going to use the typical American English pronunciation of that word Yahweh. Now, some people might find it a little, offensive to use Yahweh, being that it's the name of God. In the theology of the First Temple, they wouldn't have actually said his name. They would have used what we might call kennings to get around that. That's where we get Adonai and the Lord, instead of saying his actual name. Now, according to Gil Kedron, Yahweh is much more acceptable as a term at least in modern day Israel. It's not as shocking as what the ancient Israelites would have found. But that's his name. That's the name. So that's what we're going to go with. And also Yahweh is where we get the term Jehovah from, through a variety of sound changes from ancient Hebrew into ancient Greek into Latin. Now the meaning of the name Yahweh isn't exact, and it isn't exactly clear. It can mean something like I am, or he who is, or he that is. The name can show, it's really meant to show totality and an incalculable greatness. I am. You're what? I am. Yahweh doesn't need an adjective or descriptor after the am part. He just is. The Israelites took a journey through several stages to get to Yahweh as the only game in town. They really started off, a lot of people will say that they were polytheistic, and that's really not 100% accurate. They really made a journey through henotheism to monolatry, ending up at monotheism. Some will say that the Israelites were always monotheists, or only believed that there was one God and that there was no other gods, period. There's God, and then anybody else, any other thing that people would call a god is not actually a god at all. And to the point even that any people worshiping something that isn't the one true God is not actually worshiping a god. They're maybe worshiping nothing at all, or they're maybe worshiping something that isn't divine, or something that is an uncreated being, like maybe a fallen angel or a demon or something to that effect. Some, as we said, some scholars and people will say that the ancient Israelites were just polytheists like everybody else in the Levant, or more or less the whole world at that time, except for a few rare exceptions. Hey, there were a lot of polytheists back then, and that there is no doubt whatsoever. The Egyptians were polytheists, but don't forget, they did play around with the idea of monotheism, or at least monolatry. The Old Testament text and other texts show that the ancient Israelites were at least somewhere between a henotheist people and monolatrists. But who cares? Polytheist, monotheist, henotheist, monolatrists. We see hints of each of these in the Israelites' own sacred text, the Bible. Polytheism is the hardest to find, and I think personally that the Israelite religion doesn't really show signs of true polytheism, meaning the worship of many gods. In a situation where each of the gods more or less are on an equal footing, think of maybe the Roman and Greek paganism. People worship Zeus for certain things, Poseidon for others. Zeus was higher up in the hierarchy, but that didn't degrade in any way the divinity of Athena. Also, the actual worship of ancestors and raising people into godlike levels, like the emperor was a god king of a sort. The Israelites may have had these tendencies in the deep past, but not in a way that significantly shows up in their sacred literature. Henotheism, or the belief that other gods existed, but there is one high God that's to be worshipped above all others, is definitely a characteristic that can be found in many ways in the Israelite religion. Now, monolatry is the next step into that, and it's a key step in the movement for the Israelite religion. The belief that other gods exist, but only one God should be worshipped. And we see this clearly in the book of Exodus for sure. Moses and some of his company are mad with a capital M that the people made the golden calf. The calf likely represented either an Egyptian god or Baal. Moses is up on that mountain literally trying to hammer out a deal, a covenant with God Most High, and the people are down there worshiping other gods. Moses doesn't want any part of that. And if we look at Exodus 20-3, the commandment of thou shalt not have any gods before me, that's really a monolatrous statement. On the other hand, you could say that the rest of the Israelites and Moses' own brother, Aaron, are being henotheists. At least you could charitably say they were honoring the one God, but hedging their bets by making the golden calf. Strict monotheism is something that we will see hints of in the First Temple period, but it's really something that explodes out of the Babylonian exile. The Israelite religion of the First Temple has to be viewed through a different lens than the post-exile Babylonian exile Judaism. Post-Babylonian exile Judaism is another very complicated matter that we've touched upon a lot in this entire podcasts, History of the Papacy. But this is the time where most scholars think that the Israelite religion becomes fully monotheist. Not Yahweh is the highest God of them all or the preferred God. He is God. And that's it. And we can certainly see that the God that was worshipped by the Israelites in Solomon's temple was Yahweh. But who was Yahweh? Oh, wait, do you have a moment? A great way to support the History of the Papacy podcast is by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. Your support on Patreon goes such a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable and on the air for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in the order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you will be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now, here's a brief message from our sponsors. He's literally I am, or he that is. Yahweh is connected to the greater Canaanite Phoenician pantheon of deities. This is a generally accepted theory, but other scholars say the connection is very weak and that there was no textual evidence to make this connection. That is the biggest difficulty of sorting all of this out, especially in such a short format like today's episode. As far as topics go, this is the deepest end of the deep end of the pool of topics, not just in religion, but really the topics of any topic. Scholars have studied and debated every single aspect of Yahweh for so long, for thousands of years, essentially. We're barely dipping our toe into the pool here. But if you're interested, reach out and I can point you in at least a few directions where you can delve into your own rabbit hole. What is interesting is the scholars don't have a ton of evidence for the deep, deep past of Yahweh. The oldest direct textual evidence, or archaeological evidence for that matter, is from something called the Mesha Stele, not the Messi Stele, the Mesha Stele. This is a stone block from the area of Moab, home of the Moabites. The Moabites lived in the area just east of the Israelites to the southeast in modern-day Jordan. The Moabites were a related South Canaanite people and were pretty much in constant conflict with the Israelites. I would imagine it of a situation of competing tribes, border raiding, that sort of thing. They couldn't get along with each other, so they were in conflict with each other. Now, the Moabites were more connected in with the culture of the south and into the Arabian Peninsula, whereas Israel, for the most part, had closer connections to the northern and western Semitic groups of the Levant and the northern eastern Mediterranean coast. And what the Mesha Stele recounts is the Moabite defeat of Israel. The Stele states that the ritualistic items of Yahweh were looted and then taken back to Moab as the spoils of war. And you get this whole gist of the Mesha Stele of one tribe fighting another tribe. And look at our tribal God beat up your tribal God. And it would have been the same thing on the battlefield. Our tribal king or tribal chieftain beats up on your tribal chieftain. It's very, and I'm not trying to sell them out or sell them lowly by saying they were tribes. Tribe is a very tight organization. It's family. It's not a lot of different groups of people mashed together. It's a very homogenous group. And you can have a certain organizational structure when you are such a tight group. Now, there are other inscriptions that say or mention Yahweh from other places, including southern Egypt of all places. These inscriptions could be referring to Yahweh in different ways and not necessarily Yahweh as the God of Israel, sort of Yahweh, different versions from different pantheons or different aspects, perspectives of Yahweh. The other source of information on Yahweh is textual evidence. There are texts from the city of Ugaritic up in the northern Levant, sort of the modern day extreme southern Turkey, Syria. It's actually in Syria, but it's where Turkey and Syria meet up together. Then, of course, the biggest text of them all that we all have today is the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, or whatever you prefer to call that Israelite sacred text. A lot of people get just bent out of shape using the Bible as a historical source. I had an email exchange with a listener who reached out with the question of using the Bible, either the New or Old Testament, as a historical source. Now, he wasn't bent out of shape, not in any way, shape, or form. And we had a really fun and I think informative email exchange. His question was basically, how much can the Bible be trusted as a source when there's so many clear ahistorical and or historical accuracies in the text, events and people, places that have been shown not to have happened or happened in a quite different way based on other more objective evidence are in conflict with what was written in the Bible. My view on the Bible is that it isn't meant to be a literal history or fact book. It's clearly an anthology written at vastly different times, different places, and different genres by different people. There is biography, poetry, song, metaphor, theology. Different parts of the Bible are some of the oldest writings in human history, and other parts of the Old Testament were written pretty darn close to the dawn of the Common Era. The documents of the Old Testament were also related and edited over the years by people with different agendas, different perspectives, and different purposes than the original authors. So for me, in my opinion, the Bible, and especially the Old Testament, should be treated like any other text in a historical investigation. People shouldn't take the text purely at face value, but try to understand who wrote the text, when it was written, who it was written for, and how did the people who wrote the text understand themselves and how that was represented in the text. It's a text for a certain people at a certain time. And I personally don't think that's in any conflict if you believe that it was an inspired document inspired by the Holy Spirit or God. I think you can still see that it sits in a certain place at a certain time in a certain context. And it should be understood that way as a human document, a document for a people by a people. People should use it as how does the text line up and diverge with other texts, as well as physical archaeological evidence. I'm no historian. My degrees aren't in history, so I don't have any formal training in historical investigation methodologies. But really, how else could one conduct an investigation or a line of inquiry? You have to gather your sources, evaluate them in as many ways as you possibly can, and with as many tools as you have at your disposal. To write off a piece of evidence just because you don't like it, or you're biased against it, or because you don't like the people or the way they use that text today doesn't seem like a great way to me, or at the very least an unbiased way to study a topic. But hey, what do I know? I'm not a professional historian. Maybe they teach some sort of magic sauce in a different way on how to conduct an investigation, a line of inquiry. But, maybe I'm looking at it in the wrong way. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. But let's get back to the textual evidence for Yahweh. Besides the Bible, we have those other sources. And one of the most important sources, as we said, is those Ugaritic texts discovered in the early part of the 20th century. They were discovered in the ancient ruined city of Ugarit. Ugarit is on the northern part of the Mediterranean coast of Syria. If you look at a map, the unicorn-looking part of the island of Cyprus points directly at where Ugarit was if you follow it across the sea and where that line would make landfall. The texts that were discovered in Ugarit were a treasure trove for historians, archaeologists, linguistics, biblical scholars, you name it. One of the Ugaritic texts, the one that the opening quote comes from, is called the Baal cycle. The Baal cycle gives a clear view on the mythology that was the basis for the belief system of the northwestern Semitic Phoenicians and Canaanite people. There were there was a ton of local variation on these themes, but the base story and the characters can be found in the Baal cycle as discovered in Ugarit. The short story of the Baal cycle is that Baal was a thunder sky god. The father of the gods was a guy named El, and El wants to cut back and release some of his responsibilities to a new god. Essentially, El wants to go into semi-retirement. El is the picture of the grandfatherly, wise God. He's merciful. He's wise. El means Lord or God, but it's also the generic Semitic term just in all of these Semitic languages for God. El. Yam, or Yam, I would probably more likely, is the god of the sea, and he is the heir apparent to El. But there's another god who he's a much better fit than Yam, and his name is Baal. Baal and Yam have all types of battles and intrigues, and it pulls in all the other gods in there. Baal has to go to the underworld, but he comes back and he defeats Yam with his mighty club. Now, I just might be imagining this, but this whole story sounds a lot like the story of Heracles or Hercules, and really the base mythology of almost all Indo-European groups. That gets me thinking of many different possibilities and speculations. It could just be pure coincidence. It could also be that these ancient stories of sea gods and storm gods could have been influenced by the earliest Indo-Europeans. The area of Ugarit was flanked on two sides by early Indo-European groups. To the west was the Hittites, and to the east was the Mitanni. The religion of the Hittites was super complicated because they took in bits and pieces from everyone, but scholars think that there was a core of ancient European mythology in there with the Hittites. The Mitanni are even more obscure, but they likely would have had an even more direct connection to the Indo-European mythological tradition. But back to Baal. Baal winds up on the top of the Canaanite god pantheon heap. Yahweh gets very complicated because some scholars say that he was a minor god in the Canaanite pantheon and kind of played in with this Baal cycle. Others say that he was an influence of storm and war gods from the south, such as from the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula. One theory is that Yahweh wasn't a storm god, or at least he wasn't a traditional war storm god. He was a god of metallurgy and creation. And there's archaeology, particularly from Egypt and from Canaan, that supports this idea. There's temples near mines in Egypt in the Levant that had Yahweh cultic influence. What some scholars think is that Yahweh and El merged together into one god. And that's why we get Yahweh and El mentioned in the Bible, Elohim, or attributes of one of these gods was put onto or assimilated to another one. And this could explain a lot of how the God of the Israelites is really quite unique amongst deities. El/Yahweh was all powerful, a creator, a father, a king, but also merciful. He was responsible for his people and wanted the best for them. He was connected to his people in a way that other gods were not. And this might explain Well, Baal was such a baddie in the Bible. Baal went through a similar growth process as Yahweh. They were both upstarts, movers and shakers in the Canaanite pantheon. Baal and Yahweh were fighting over similar turf, you might say. They were both supreme gods associated with the elemental forces of the sky, storms, etc. They came to those attributes from slightly different directions, though. The Temple of Solomon's location in Jerusalem is key. According to the Bible and archaeology, there were individual tribes of Israelites that lived throughout the central to southern part of Levant. They eventually coalesced into a united kingdom of Israel, according to the Bible, but not 100% backed up to other sources. The united kingdom had 3 kings: Saul, David, and Solomon, hence the Temple of Solomon. We'll get into what existed before Solomon in an upcoming episode. After Solomon, and just the short story of that is, during the time of David and Saul, religious practices would have been done in other locations, particularly the mobile tent temple, the tabernacle. But we'll get into that in the next episode. After Solomon, the United Kingdom separated into 2 parts. The Kingdom of Israel to the north, which is more or less in the area of Samaria, and then the Kingdom of Judah to the south. Both of the kingdoms were fairly powerful and prosperous. Both Israel and Judah shared a common Israelite religion, but it was a diverse, henotheistic, borderline monolatrist religion based around the Yahweh cult. The northern kingdom of Israel was connected into the rich and powerful Phoenician trade system to the north in what is now Lebanon. The Phoenicians worshipped a version of Baal, among others. Baal worship of the Phoenicians definitely rubbed off on the northern kingdom of Israel, Israelite religion. And we see this all over the Old Testament document. The northern kingdom of Israel was always falling into Baal worship. See the Jezebel story. Just look at the names of the people involved in the Jezebel story, Jezebel and Elijah. Jezebel has a name that includes a Baal component, and Elijah's name has the Yahweh component. The Elijah would have been pronounced something that more represented the Yah component. But for the most part, the Old Testament was a Judahite southern kingdom project. And you can always go straight to the cynical. The Old Testament depiction of the northern kingdom of Israel is driven by the political bias of the southern Judahite writers and redactors. But it could be they were accurately depicting a serious difference of opinion or outlook with their northern neighbors and kinsmen. The 2 kingdoms were so similar in so many ways, but the differences can lead to huge conflict, especially with those 2 conflicts that were conflicted over resources, trade, and the dominance of the religion. Who's the leader of this Israelite religion? The the king of Judah or the king of Israel? The final piece of the puzzle to put into place with who was worshipped at the temple is, how did the Israelites become a group that evolved away from depicting their God in art and images? The Israelite religion became uniquely aniconic. There is another really tricky and complicated area of discussion that we're just going to slightly wade into. Depending on your perspective, you will start with the very different ideas. Generally speaking, both modern-day Jews and Christians, along with Muslims, would say you cannot depict God in images. Images are made even more complicated in Christianity. Some Christians are very much against sacred art and depictions altogether. Most Christian groups, now I say most because there are groups that don't follow this, but most Roman Catholics, Orthodox, and others would say that Jesus, as the second person of the Trinity, can be depicted in art, but that God the Father, the first person of the Trinity, cannot be depicted. Now, the third person, the Holy Spirit, can also be depicted as well. The Holy Spirit is depicted as a dove. Aniconism is something that slowly came into the Israelite religion. Aniconism is related to the fact that God can't be depicted because if you saw God, you would just burn up. He is too great and all-encompassing to observe, let alone describe in word and art. It's trying to describe the universe, the elemental forces, everything in a picture or a couple of words. You can't get everything in there. It's not humanly possible. The archaeology shows that the Israelites and the Judahites did depict their God in art in some cases. There are figurines, particularly of a large standing stone called Mesha and other depictions. Again, like with all of this with Yahweh and the religion of the first temple, there's a lot of controversy and disagreement between different scholars and religions on what all these depictions mean. There will be parts of the Bible where some will say something happened and was done by angels, but others will say that the scene was a theophany or an event where God himself was a part of the action. One example of this from the pre-First Temple period is the hospitality of Abraham in Genesis. The destruction of the First Temple and the subsequent Babylonian exile likely kicked this aniconism to the next level. That's another long story and an interesting story, but a story for a different time and a different day. We've seen in a very short and simplified way how Yahweh developed from a God of many gods to one God and only one God. You can't have a temple without a God, and we can see the rough outline of the God of the Israelites. Now, I have 2 more episodes planned out for this quick mini-series inside of a mini-series. The next episode will be on the tabernacle, the mobile tent temple of the Israelites in their first exile from Egypt, which will provide the blueprint for Solomon's bricks and mortar temple. We'll have another couple of episodes. I have a couple of special episodes in the works as well before we get into our next major series. After that, we'll wrap up and by actually stepping into Solomon's temple itself, or at least trying to. I would also really like to do a Q&A or an Ask Me Anything episode where you can send in your speculation scenarios. And if you send them in soon, I can try to get Gary Stevens in on the action to hash out those speculations. I want to thank you very much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.